Hello to everyone out there. So I'm Eric Freeman and Beth Robson's here. We're in cloudy Bainbridge Island today. And just a little bit about how this talk came together. We just finished up our latest book, which is Head First HTML5 Programming. And in writing that, we discovered there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about HTML5, what it can do, what it is, what you need to watch out for if you're getting into it. And depending on what you read in the press, you could have heard anything over the last year from HTML5's 10 years off into the future, or you should be using it right now. So what we did is we put this together after writing the book to help people understand what you should do and how to get started with HTML5. And by way of introduction, and hold on, I'm just getting the slide system figured out here. There we go. By way of introduction, I'm Eric Freeman. I've been working with O'Reilly for almost 8 years now and have done 3 books in the Head First series. I've also had another career, which is as a media company executive, and spent a fair bit of time being the CTO for Disney.com. I just left Disney last May to focus on writing and this kind of thing. And by training, I'm a computer scientist.
And hi, everybody. This is Elizabeth Robson, and I also go by Beth. And I am the co-author of 3 Head First books with Eric. And the most recent one, as Eric mentioned, is Head First HTML5 Programming. And I'm also the co-founder of wickedlysmart.com with Eric, which is an online education company. We're focused on web development right now.
All right, so we're just going to jump right into the 10, because 10 is a lot to get through in 45 minutes or so. And I'll warn you up front, too, the first 2 things you should know about HTML, we'll take up a fair bit of the program, then we'll move a little faster through the rest of them. And the first one is that HTML markup, that is, the declaration language that we use to create HTML, it's really not that big of a deal. Now, to know what that means, we need to step back a little bit and say, well, what is HTML5 anyway? And, you might be saying, well, is HTML5 just some incremental update to HTML itself? Or, given what I've been reading, is it something entirely new and different? The answer is it's actually a bit of both, and that's one of the things that's made it confusing for people. So if we just talk about HTML5 markup, HTML5 itself has been, first of all, simplified in some very useful and good ways, and we'll show you that in just a second. But there's also been some additions to the markup that make a lot of the things that we do today when we're building web pages a little more easier and a little more semantically meaningful. So there's a whole other side, though, of HTML5, and that is there's a family of technologies that now work with HTML. And we refer to these usually as the HTML5 APIs. These are JavaScript APIs, and we'll go into those, too, a little bit more in a minute. But, there are things like geolocation or the video element or drag and drop or all these things that you can now do with HTML5 that we couldn't before. Now, let me say one other thing, too, about terminology. There are those out there that want to be very specific about the way they talk about HTML5. So HTML5, it's the markup standard and a few things that go along with that. And all these technologies, well, those are other things. And so, people want you to be really strict about the way you say the word. The way we use it is in the general sense, and I think that's the way you'll see it used in the press and the way people are talking about it. And that is HTML5 is really that set of technologies that's going to allow us to build the next generation of both web pages and web applications. And so we actually, in that list, include the new HTML markup, the HTML5 APIs, and CSS as well. And one of the exciting things that's happened with CSS is that a lot of the things we used to use JavaScript to do, sort of fancy transitions in our pages and those kinds of things, those have now been pushed into CSS, which makes them even easier. All right, so based on that, we're now going to step now into the simplification of HTML5. And here's another thing you should know. If you know HTML now, if you know HTML 4.01, the previous standard, you're in a really good position to get into HTML5 because, one, HTML5, for the most part, is fully backwards compatible. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to take an HTML4 page, and we're just going to transition to an HTML5 page. We claim in 60 seconds. We'll see what really happens.
Yeah. So it might take a little longer than 60 seconds, but so say you've got your HTML4 page and you're using strict HTML4. So you've got your strict doc type at the top of the page, and then you've got your head and your body as normal. What are the things that you can do to your page to make it HTML5? The first thing you want to do is you want to remove all the extra stuff in the doc type. And the good news is that it makes the doc type a lot simpler. So what you're left with is essentially doc type HTML, which is awesome. Now you might be wondering, well, what happened to the version number? Don't we need that? And it turns out that the main reason that we needed doc type all along was to keep browsers from going into what's called quirks mode and make sure that they're rendering the page in what we would prefer them to render it in, which is standards mode. Now we don't have to worry about that because browsers are much more aligned with the standards, and because, as Eric mentioned, HTML5 is going to be backwards compatible. When we add new features in, they're going to be compliant with the current, whatever the current standard is for HTML5, and so this one doc type should carry us forward into the future, we hope, fingers crossed, and it's a lot easier to remember, which is great.
So here too, this is something everyone should pause a second and just think about, which is doc type HTML. That is the new doc type for now and evermore. There will never be a doc type HTML6.
Right.
This is it.
This is it. Yay! The next change we can make to our page is to remove the extraneous stuff in the meta tag and change it to just meta charset equals UTF-8. And this is the one meta tag that you need in order to have your page validate as HTML5. There are other meta tags which are optional, but this is the one that's required for validation. And we got lucky with this because older browsers were already looking at the charset part of that tag, the content tag, as a separate attribute because so many people would forget to type that extra quotation mark. And so this meta charset actually works now even on some of the older browsers. Now the next step we can take is to remove the type attribute on the link and the script tags. That's an optional step, and the type attribute still works fine as it is, but you don't need it anymore, and the reason is because CSS is now the default styling language for HTML5, and JavaScript is now the default scripting language for HTML5. So by removing those extra attributes, we can make the head part of our document even simpler. So this is what we're left with. It's much simpler, much shorter, and easier to remember, and if those are the changes that you make to your HTML4 page, it will now validate as HTML5.
Yeah. So if you want to get to HTML5,
this is the fastest route.
Well, if you do this, you're done. But obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. So, the other aspect of HTML5 markup is actually the markup. And so, as I said, there have been some additions there. And just to talk for a second about how the standards bodies went about adding those additions. If you look at what I've got here, it's really a depiction of pretty common design for a web page.
Yeah.
And what we tend to do is we tend to use divs to create different content areas where those are headers, navigation, sections, side quotes, that kind of thing, or footers. And you find this all over the place. Or, if you think about maybe, an online shop, it might have slightly different things. And so what the standards bodies did was actually quite smart. So they went out and they grabbed a lot of pages and looked at them. And they looked at how people were doing this. And of course, they hit div equals ID equals navigation and nav and, every permutation of how you spell these things. But in the end, they took all that, synthesized it, and then came back with, all right, here's a bunch of stuff people are doing in their pages. And what they did is they then created elements to represent those things. And, a design principle they use is called pave the cowpaths. If you're not familiar with that, it just means take the way people are doing things now and enable them to do it. Don't go make up a bunch of new ways to do it because probably they're not going to do that. And so this is just an example where we've gone through and used the new HTML5 elements to replace those divs. We've got the header, the nav, the section, the aside, footer as examples. We're not going to go through those. I think it's pretty clear what they are here. And you might say, well, what's the big deal? Don't divs work fine? They do. And you can keep using divs if you want to. If you want to move to these new elements, what you get out of it is better readability. If you've ever had to trace down a bunch of nested divs and their end tags, that's kind of a pain. This makes it much easier. We're automatically getting better semantics and clearer structure because div ID equals some name. A search engine can't really look at that and determine what that means. a search engine sees header or nav, it knows exactly what that is, and it knows what the intent of that is. So that gets better. And, you know, also, it's going to make IDEs work a little better, too. So that's all good stuff. It's not going to change the world, no, but they're nice things to have in the language. Now, there are actually a lot more than just those ones I mentioned. And again, we're not going to go through all these. Just very quickly, we've got a bunch of them that apply to structure and semantics, as we point out here on this slide. There's a bunch of new input types, too. So, you know, if you're collecting data from the user, right now we write a lot of JavaScript code to do a lot of verification and make sure things are what they are. But some of those ways of collecting data become more native. And then there actually are, you know, so our claim that HTML markup isn't a big deal, it's only about half true because there are some big additions. And the video tag I'm sure you've heard of, we'll talk about it a little more in a second. That's a big addition. So, you know, you can put video on the page without a plugin. You can do the same with audio. It's very similar to video. And then there's the canvas, which is a 2D drawing surface. And again, we'll come back to that in just a second, too.
So you might be wondering, with all these new HTML5 elements, can I use those elements in browsers now? And the answer is, for the most part, yes. However, you need to watch out if you have a big audience that's still using IE8 and earlier. And the reason you have to worry about this specific browser is because IE8 and earlier does not add elements that it doesn't understand to the DOM correctly. Fortunately, there is a simple fix to this. It was written specifically to solve this problem, and it's available at code.google.com. I think Yasmina will probably put that URL in the chat room. And it's called the HTML5 shim. And what it does is it creates the elements in the DOM so that IE8 will recognize them correctly so that you can then style them and use JavaScript to manipulate the DOM and so on. The good news is that Internet Explorer 9 does now recognize the new elements correctly. So as we get more users switching over to 9 over the next couple of years, this problem will eventually go away. And of course, for the other major browsers, they already recognize these elements and put them in the DOM correctly. So
just to sum up, thing one you should know, the markup, it really isn't that big a deal, you know, in terms of getting into it, understanding it. And if you're on top of HTML already, it's a pretty easy transition. And in fact, most of your HTML that you've already written, it's going to be backwards compatible. You just need to make a few simple tweaks if you want to validate. And with that, we'll move on to thing number 2.
Yep. Thing number 2 is that JavaScript is really where the power of HTML5 happens. And so we've talked a lot about the markup and how some of it's not that big of a deal, but when it comes to really using HTML5 to its fullest power, you want to learn JavaScript. And so I'm going to take you through some of the things that we show you how to do in the book, which will give you an idea of the kinds of things that you can do with JavaScript and HTML5 together. So for example, one of the things that is fairly new to web applications is geolocation. And there is a JavaScript API called geolocation that you can use to add location awareness to your web apps, which is really exciting on mobile web apps. And it's a pretty simple API. There's not a whole lot to it. It basically just gives your app information about the coordinates of where your user is located. And if you want to do things like combine that with maps, then you'll need to go off and use a separate mapping API like Google Maps or something. But despite being simple, it's very cool, and a lot of people are using it in mobile web apps. Another JavaScript API is associated with Canvas, and the Canvas is a new element and a new API that's part of HTML5. And what Canvas is basically just what Eric said. It's a drawing surface that you can add to your page and put graphics into without needing any plugins. And you can draw shapes, you can draw lines, you can put images into it, you can put text into it, all kinds of things. And if you've looked at any of the HTML5 demos that are out there on the web, you've probably seen lots of Canvas demos because the amount of things that you can do with it is just almost endless, and people are doing some amazingly creative things with Canvas. Similar to Canvas, we have another new element, video, for HTML5 that also has an extensive JavaScript API. And so you can put video into your page without using JavaScript, but if you want to do something like build your own custom player, which we do in the book, we take you through how to build a custom player with buttons and to do all kinds of things with video, then you'll need to learn that JavaScript API. And in HTML5, video and Canvas actually play very well together, and you can use them together to do some really cool things. So for instance, if you wanted to add effects to your video, you can use Canvas to grab the video data and do things like black and white video or sci-fi video. Next is web storage, and that is basically a way to store data on the client. And so some of the things that you're using cookies for now, you'll start using web storage for. And the great thing is with web storage, you've got a lot more space. You've got 5 megabytes in your user's browser to store data. And then the last one I want to mention is web workers, which is a JavaScript API that lets you create concurrent threads in your web application, which is really cool because now for the first time in a web application, we can access the power that we all have sitting on our laps with multiple core machines, and you can do things in your web applications that you could never have done before. Like in the book, we show how to do a Mandelbrot set fractal explorer, which has some pretty heavy computation in it, and it's just slow as beans until you add web workers, and which really speeds it up, which is very, very cool.
Yeah, what's really cool about that example too is by tweaking the number of web workers and pulling up your activity monitor on your machine, you can see the cores actively being used or not used depending on how many web workers you have. So it's a really nice thing to be able to do in a browser now.
Right. So very quickly, how does JavaScript work with your web pages? It basically works the same way that you've been doing all along, which is to allow you to manipulate the DOM and update your page dynamically. But now you have all these new capabilities with these JavaScript APIs for Canvas, for video, web workers. You've got this local storage, web storage. You've got drag and drop. You've got geolocation. You've got web sockets. So you've got a ton of new features now that you can use to make your pages behave more like apps than ever before, which is a very cool thing. And just real quickly, some other things that you might not know about JavaScript are that it has now been declared the official language of HTML5, which I did mention earlier. And browser makers have been spending a ton of time and effort improving the performance of JavaScript in the last decade. So JavaScript now runs in your browser probably 100 times faster than it did 10 years ago. And it's also a really easy language to get into. So if you're new to programming, it's a great way to get started with programming because it's very easy to create a small little program in your browser and have it do something very cool. And yet at the same time, JavaScript is now a pretty sophisticated and powerful language. And it has modern constructs like closures, and it has a prototypal object model. And fortunately, all the browser makers have converged on a JavaScript standard that's based on the ECMAScript standard. So we have a lot more consistency between the different browsers, which makes it a lot easier for us as web developers to create web applications across all browsers and even mobile apps.
JavaScript's had a bad rap for a long time since the beginning, and some of that early on was performance. Some of that, honestly, there are some warts in the language itself, but they're easily avoided.
Yep.
But with all the attention that's been put on JavaScript, from sort of the big companies out there now, everyone's investing a lot of money in JavaScript. It's incredibly fast at this point.
Yep.
As you'll see in a second, you can actually do real-time video processing in JavaScript in the browser, and so if you haven't taken it seriously in the past, you should now. And there's actually a lot of tools coming out as well. So you may be able to work at a higher level in the future and still be generating JavaScript for the browser.
Great.
So with that, we're going to move on to number 3. And like I said, we'll start moving a little faster now. The question comes up, how do you know if you should be using HTML5 already? If you're out there, you've got a population of users that you're supporting through your website, how do you know if it's time? And so we put together this simple little flow chart, which will help you think about that. And so the first question you should ask yourself, which is actually misnamed here a little bit, is how many mobile device users do you have? And I think we say smartphone here, but it should really be mobile device. How many mobile users do you have out there? And if you have a lot that you're supporting, then you should really be strongly considering HTML5 now. All the mobile browsers out there support it, and they're heavily used by your users. And so that's an automatic yes, start looking into it. If the answer is no, if you're largely delivering content to desktop users, then you've got to ask yourself the IE question. And that is, are most of your users, this question's inverted here. Do you have a low percentage percentage of your users that are using IE. If that's true, yeah, go ahead and look at HTML5 because that means your users are largely on modern browsers, and there's just a heck of a lot of support for HTML5 already in all of those browsers. If you do have a lot of IE 8 or before users out there, then proceed with caution. You really got to look at your situation. You might even have to try to get your users to move off of that before you really make a strong move into HTML5. Or you've got to do a lot of testing in your page and have some graceful degradation in terms of what they see versus your other users. But all we wanted to do here was give you a simple little flow chart to answer the question, should I be looking at it now?
Yep. So we talked about a lot of the different JavaScript APIs and pieces of HTML5, that family of technologies. And you might have heard some rumblings about which API, which specification a different API might belong to. And so what we wanted with this number 4 item is to encourage you not to worry about that so much. And I'm going to quickly run through how it's set up. But what I'd like to encourage you to do, instead of worrying about which specification an API belongs to, focus more on does the browser support that API and what is the functionality of that API. Really, the way that it's breaking down right now for the JavaScript APIs and the functionality of HTML5 is in 2 main working groups that are part of the W3C. We have the HTML5 working group, which is responsible for the core markup, new APIs associated with elements like video and canvas, and of course the core document and element functionality, and then some APIs like drag and drop also fall into the HTML5 working group. And then we have another working group, which is the Web Apps working group, which is focused on all those other JavaScript APIs that work with HTML5 that you use to create your web apps. And this is where specifications for things like web workers, web storage, geolocation show up, as well as DOM4. DOM level 4 is now in the Web Apps working group. So this is just kind of a high-level overview of how it's structured, but don't worry about it too much. If you want to use web workers and you go and you determine that most of your users are using browsers that support web workers, then just go use them and don't worry so much about the which specification it is and if it's an official HTML5 specification.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little motivation to that, which is as we were writing the book, we'd have a conversation with someone about using geolocation as an HTML5 API, and we'd get back, wait, that's not part of the HTML5 specification. What we say is, who cares? What really matters is geolocation implemented across all the modern browsers? The answer is yes. And so let's use it.
Go use it.
And let's not worry about which working group it's come out of. With all due respect to the working groups, because they do great stuff. But
yep.
All right, so we can move on to number 5. All right, so I'm sure if there's one thing you've heard about with respect to HTML5, it's probably the video tag. And the video tag's great. It allows you to put video in your page without a plugin. And so I've got a little markup here on the left that is just a video element. And we'll just look at it really quickly. So we've got a source attribute, very much like the image element. You just point it to the video you want. If you want, you can put in a poster image that gets shown when the video isn't playing. You can add controls over top of it so that you can play, pause, affect the volume, that sort of thing. And with height, and then there are obviously other attributes too that you can add onto this. That's really all it takes to get video into your page. But that's the easy part. So moving ahead here. So the hard part is this. All the folks that have created these browsers, they all agree for the most part on the video element and what it does and what the specification does. What no one has agreed on is what are the video formats. And we currently have 3 contenders. WebM out of Google, MP4, which has been supported strongly in the past by Microsoft and Apple, and then we have kind of the open source contingent with OGG. And then for each one of those, we obviously have the different encodings for the format. Those are just container formats with WebM, MP4, and OGG. And so it's kind of back to that question, what's your user population? If you're serving content, let's say just to iOS devices, okay, it's pretty easy. You can just worry about MP4 and serve your content that way and you're done. But if you're trying to serve content across a broad population, all of a sudden, you've got to worry about all these formats, or you got to find a CDN that will worry about it for you. And so this is the real pain right now of the video tag. Now, there is a way using markup itself, as I have here on the right side of the slide, where you can go ahead, you can generate those encodings for your video, and you can supply different source tags so that when the browser gets this tag, it'll look and say, let's see, can I play MP4? Nope. Can I play a WebM? Yep, I can play that. Okay, I'll play that. And then it steps down. Now, there are ways to do fallbacks, too, and I encourage you to go look at the book for how to do that, whether that's a fallback to an image or, say, a fallback to playing Flash, if you want to. So go check that out. But video element easy, encoding's kind of a mess. And unfortunately, once you step into the encoding world, it's kind of a deep, messy world. Again, unless you can just get a CDN to handle it all for you.
Yeah, which is nice.
Which is nice. Which can be nice.
Yeah. All right, so the next thing, which is number 6, and that is that JSON is the new king of content formats. And you've probably heard of JSON by now. It's been around for a while, but if you haven't, what you want to know about it is that it's used as an alternative to XML for serializing data. And JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and the reason is because basically what it does is it takes an object that you've written in JavaScript and just stringifies it. It just turns it into a string, and you can then pass that string around. You can use it in your AJAX programs if you want, and we like it because it's more readable than XML, and it's a lot easier to parse because all of the browsers include this JSON object that has just 2 methods, stringify and parse. Stringify takes a JavaScript object and turns it into a JSON string, and parse just pulls that object back out again. And now we're also finding that a lot of web services are using JSON as a preferred format for delivering data. So, for example, Twitter has a JSON service, so you can pull down people's tweets in the JSON format. And the advantage of JSON is that it is so easy to get from that serialized version of an object into an object without having to do the fancy XML parsing and having to worry about doing that yourself.
Well, plus, it's just more readable, and it's what you're used to looking at. If you're doing JavaScript programming, why not send the object in the same format as you've created in your code?
Right, exactly. You don't have to do this translation between a JavaScript object and XML anymore. You can just basically say, just make it into a string, and it's kind of like magic. It works. So if you're going to use JSON, the advantages of JSON are, as we said, we think it's more readable. You don't have to worry about parsing it. It's automatically parsed into JavaScript objects for you using this JSON object that comes in all browsers. And it's used with the what's called the JSON P model, which is JSON with padding. And this is another common thing you'll find with web services out there now. If, for instance, I want to get tweets and use them in my web application, I can send a request to Twitter to give me JSON data and wrap that JSON data in a function call. And then if I implement that callback in my code, it hands me the JSON string. It gets automatically parsed into an object, and I can start using it as a JSON object in my function immediately. So it makes it really easy to get data from web services. Now, the disadvantage of JSON is that, as with any remote service, when you get a JSON string that gets turned into an object, it could contain malicious things that, if you eval that string or do something with that string in your code, could cause problems in your web application. But it's not any different than if you used, any other JavaScript library. You just have to make sure you trust the source.
Just one thing about JSON-P. JSON-P, if you haven't used it, you're not familiar with it, it's one of these mind-bending things that you have to wrap your brain around to be able to use the first time. And so we try to do a pretty good job of breaking it down in the book. So I encourage you to go there if you really want to get your head around JSON-P. The other thing, too, is we're in a weird position now where we're still really working out the security models for remote access on the web, and JSON-P is definitely a way you can kind of break through that right now. Right.
So instead of having to worry about the cross-domain issues with AJAX, people are starting to use this JSON-P model as a way to kind of get around that. Now, there are some coming changes with AJAX that are going to make that easier, but they're still quite a ways off. So for now, JSON-P is kind of a good way to get around some of those security issues. But again, you have to be careful. You have to trust the
and if you're going to use any of kind of the big important web services like Twitter, JSON-P is a very good thing to know and use with that.
Definitely.
All right, I think we're moving on to the next one. So number 7 is make graceful degradation and feature detection easy on yourself. And it's really, the slide's really more about feature detection because graceful degradation's kind of up to you and how you want to handle your user if a feature of HTML5 isn't there. And I'm largely talking here about an API. So let's say you've written some code, you're expecting the geolocation API to be there. Well, how do you know if it's not there, and what do you do? So I'm going to talk more about how do you know if it's not there and what you're going to do, because that's really up to you. But as it is now, there's a bit of an ugly world in terms of feature detection. It's not that ugly, but I've got 3 examples here. The first is detecting if geolocation exists. That happens to be a property of the navigator object. So you just say if navigator.geolocation, okay, then I have geolocation. If you want to know if web workers is there, you do it a different way. You look for worker as a property of a window. And so a little different. And if you want to know if the browser supports the video tag, well, then what you have to do is you have to go create a video element and then test if that element was created, test if there's a reference to video after that. And it actually keeps going. So for every API, it seems like every single one of them is different. Again, these aren't hard, but it just makes life more difficult. So what we suggest is that you go get Modernizr, and this is an open source library. You can go to the site. You can customize the little piece that you want to use in terms of which features you want to detect, so you can get that code size down really small. And it just provides a nice, clean, consistent interface to feature detection. So all that code I just had reduces down to this. If Modernizr.geolocation, if Modernizr.webworkers, if Modernizr.video, and the rest of them are pretty obvious in the same. Modernizr.canvas, whatever. Not only that, but Modernizr goes even beyond just the high-level HTML5 APIs. For instance, you can detect CSS3 features with Modernizr and know if those exist or not as well. So this is just a very easy way to make your life easier, and it's being used pretty broadly at this point, and is well supported. So you can feel pretty safe in jumping in and using this.
And I just wanted to say one more thing too about feature detection in general. And there's probably not a whole lot of people out there who are still using user agent sniffing, or what we call browser sniffing, to determine what to show your users. And that really is kind of an old school method that you want to move away from and go towards using this feature detection instead, and offering alternative experiences depending on what features are available in the browser, rather than doing it by browser version.
All right, so we'll move on to number 8. And so this is really revisiting something that Elizabeth brought up earlier, which is if you look at Canvas just on a first look looks like an API for writing a draw program, an iDraw or something like that. I mean, you have the ability to create lines and arcs and rectangles and do fills and set stroke widths and all those sorts of things. And you can do some transforms and some more advanced things as well. But you might look at it and say, you know what, I don't really have that much of a need for that kind of thing in my web page, and you can move on. But actually, Canvas is much more powerful than that. And I'll just give you 2. Sorry, I've been told my slides didn't forward. There we go. So I'll just give you 2 quick examples without going into detail, but I just want to leave with you that you should really consider Canvas and what you can do with it. And so I'll start with the example on the right side, which both of these are from the book. And if you would like to, using HTML5, take your video source and alter it in any way. Let's say that you want to do a video effect over top of it. Let's say that you want to make it black and white or sepia or anything. I mean, let's say another example is you got a video that has green screen, and you want to, in your page, take that green screen out and provide a real background. They might say, well, that's crazy. We're going to do that in JavaScript? Yes, you can do that in JavaScript. JavaScript is that fast, and you have the tools to do that now. But the way you do it is this. You write a piece of JavaScript code that goes in, and you grab the frames of the video, and and then you do your computation on that frame. It'll say removing the green screen and replacing it. And then what you do is you throw it into a canvas. And this is actually the only way you can do this, because there's no way using the video API to get a computation into the video player. All you can do is grab the frames as they're decoded. And so that's one use of Canvas, is to take video material and throw it on there. And you can do double buffering techniques. You can do this for games, for your scene in a game, or all sorts of things like that. So Canvas is pretty powerful. The other thing that we did as well in the book is Beth was talking about the fractal viewer that we wrote with web workers. And so we've got web workers running on different cores on the machine from the browser, generating pieces of the fractal, which are then being thrown into the canvas as the place that everything ends up. So it's really this general purpose display that you can use in a bunch of different ways. I encourage you to take a look at it.
All right, so number 9. As we mentioned earlier, we kind of lump CSS in with that sort of HTML5 family of technologies. And one of the reasons we do is because there's a lot of things you can do in CSS now that you used to have to do either with JavaScript or with funky HTML tables with images and so on. So what CSS has done is replaced some of those common JavaScript idioms for doing basic animations and effects. And you can now do it without actually writing any JavaScript code. So let's take a look at the first example, and that is using a new CSS property called transition. And what transition does is it lets you take a property like opacity, and instead of immediately switching from one value of opacity, say fully opaque, to fully transparent, it lets you transition that value over the course of time. So in this case, what I've done is I've got a div which starts out as being fully opaque, and what I'm saying is when the div changes, in this case by hovering my mouse over it, and the opacity of that div changes to 0, what I want to do is transition the opacity from fully opaque to fully transparent over the course of 0.5 seconds with an ease-in-out function. So that means it happens gradually at the beginning and gradually at the end. So you get this really nice kind of fading effect on an element, and you used to have to do that with JavaScript. And in fact, you'll find that libraries like jQuery include a fade function because it was such a common animation that people wanted to have in their programs. And now you can do that with CSS. Note that also because transition is such a new property that's been added to CSS, we still need to include the browser-specific implementations of those properties. So that's why you see the WebKit transition, the Moz transition, the O transition for Opera, and the MS transition for IE. And then at the very bottom, you put what the final CSS property is going to be, so that once it gets implemented in the browser, that'll be the property that you use. So for now, you do have to write all 5 of those, but eventually we'll be able to get rid of the browser-specific ones. Another example I wanted to take you through real quick is the transform, which is another new property in CSS. And what this does is it takes an element, and you can do things like rotate it and scale it and so on. And so if you look in the bottom rule here, what I'm saying is when I hover over this div, I want to transform it so that it rotates 720 degrees, which is 2 times around a circle, and gets twice as big. Now, if I don't have a transition there, when I hover over that div, that transform will happen immediately. So the div will immediately rotate, and I won't see that rotation happen. It'll just do it, and then it'll get twice as big. By adding a transition and combining these 2 properties, I can then actually make that happen over the course of a second. So I actually see the div turning, and I actually see it growing bigger over the course of 1 second. So by combining transition and transform together, you can add really nice animation effects to your web apps with just CSS.
Wow, we're at number 10 already. So you might ask, what happened to XHTML if you're paying attention to HTML back around 2004? Because in 2004, 2005, XML and XHTML were going to take over the world. And what happened along the way is people didn't like it, just to put it out there. to the point where Tim Berners-Lee in 2006 had a famous posting saying, look, we tried to do this revolutionary thing with XML. It seems like now we're going to have to evolve HTML. And then by, I think it was 2008 or 9, which I can't remember the famous posting was, but they basically didn't renew the charter on XHTML 1.2. Sorry, 2.
Yep.
XHTML2, effectively killing it and replacing it with HTML5. And so you might say, okay, well, that's the end of XML. Not really. You can still do XHTML. Now we call it XHTML5, which I don't think we have on the slide anywhere, but that is what it's called now. And you might say, well, why would I want to? And so, there are people that want to do this kind of thing. One, it does allow you to go in and validate the strictness of your document. You can still validate HTML5, though. It's not like there's not validators there as well. It plays well in XML environments. So, there are cases where people need XML in different environments, whether it's through various tools or processing or those sorts of things, where you need a well-structured document. And inserting it, you might need to insert something like SVG into your document as well, and we'll come back to that in just a second. It's also something you might want to use if you want to create a document, and again, you might want to do that if you have a tool set, for instance, that requires a document. And some people honestly just, they know the XML syntax and they like it, and they want to be strict about things. And so with HTML5, you've got both possibilities there.
Yep.
So let's just look at a very quick example of this.
Yeah, so I wanted to show you an example actually of SVG, and this is a really, really simple example of SVG. But if you are at all interested in graphics or creating games, then you definitely want to look at SVG. There are some amazing things that you can do with it. And if you go out and look for SVG HTML5 demos, you will find some just amazing demos out there to inspire you. And so basically, because SVG is an XML-based extension of the language, you do need to use what we call XHTML5. So that just means adding the namespace to your HTML tag using XHTML style elements. So for instance, you can see that in the meta tag up there, it's an empty tag. So I'm using the slash at the end there to indicate that. You want to make sure that you quote all your attributes and do all the things that you need to do for XHTML. And then to insert SVG, you just insert the SVG element, and you can start using the other SVG elements like circle and so on to create a graphics web app there. So the good news is that things like SVG are now actually supported by all modern browsers, including IE9. And the thing you have to remember is when you are serving XHTML, you need to serve it as application/XHTML plus XML, which was traditionally a huge problem, especially with IE, because it didn't do the right thing, essentially. But now modern browsers do the right thing, and you just need to make sure that you're serving the document correctly, and you're good to go. So XHTML still lives.
All right, so that concludes the 10, and as we always say at the end of our books, this doesn't have to be a goodbye.
Yep.
And we encourage you to come over to Wickedly Smart, where we talk about this stuff, and we're developing lots more content.
Yep.
Along these lines.
And
as I said, that's what we do these days.
Yep. And so if you have questions, we would love to take questions for you. And I see the Q&A tab over there is orange. That means
I'm a newbie on this thing, but I also encourage Yasmin to come and save us and tell us what to do here.
Well, that was a fantastic presentation, Eric and Elizabeth. And yes, we have several questions, and they're still coming in. If you want to click on that Q&A tab, you can see the questions that we currently have gathered for you. Would you like to just take a few? We do have time to answer just a few questions, or if I can read them to you if you prefer.
So I saw one person asked, what's a good book to read if you want to learn JavaScript, to learn how to use these new JavaScript APIs? And actually, I wanted to mention that the first 4 chapters of our new book actually take you through the basics of JavaScript, pretty much everything you need to know in order to get through the rest of the book. Now, it's certainly not comprehensive by any means, but it will get you going on JavaScript. And then there are tons and tons of other JavaScript books out there. One of my favorites is, of course, The Definitive Guide by David Flanagan. That is an excellent, excellent JavaScript book. And there's another one out there named, I think...
Well, there's the JavaScript Bible is another kind of comparable book.
And another good one out there for learning JavaScript is also Eloquent JavaScript. But if you do decide to get headfirst HTML5 programming, the first 4 chapters are all about JavaScript.
Yeah, I just want to say a little more about that. So when we started out writing this new book, we actually didn't intend to include any JavaScript training at all in it. You know, we were going to assume going in that you knew JavaScript, you knew HTML, and we were just going to hit the road running with the APIs. But when we really thought about it, we thought there's a lot of people in the person that asked us questions camp, which is, yeah, I may have seen some JavaScript, and I might know another language or two, but how do I really get into JavaScript? And as I said, there are a lot of kind of warts in JavaScript, and you want to learn the good parts. Actually, there's a good book out there too, JavaScript: The Good Parts, which I think is an early book, which is a very interesting book. And so we finally just came to the realization, okay, we have to write 4 chapters essentially on JavaScript, and it actually delayed the book a couple months. But I do encourage you to go there as a starter, and then just to repeat what Beth said, there's a lot of good books out there, you know, in terms of reference books and those kinds of things. So
yeah,
hopefully that helps.
Yeah. There's another question about using Canvas versus using SVG, and that's a really great question because they're both good for adding graphics to your web pages, but they're entirely different. And so when you go into Canvas, you're basically manipulating pixels. It's kind of like, you know, that old bitmap format. You're writing pixels to the screen, and there's no concept of, you know, a circle object or a square object. And if you want to manage what you create on the screen as objects, then you'll have to do that yourself. You have to write all that code yourself. Now, there are some new Canvas libraries that are coming out. Processing.js is one that comes to mind, which is just fantastic. That makes it easier for you to do graphics programming in Canvas, but it is a fairly low-level graphics programming API. SVG is completely different because there you are manipulating objects, and you can get many of the same effects that you can get with Canvas using SVG, but you do have the advantage of being able to manipulate those objects at a higher level. So that's really kind of the main difference between Canvas and SVG. So it's kind of up to you which route you take. I would take a look at some of the demos out there and look at how they were implemented, some with Canvas, some with SVG, and dig into it a little bit. Because I've seen, you know, for instance, games I've seen implemented in Canvas, and I've seen them implemented in SVG. So it's going to kind of depend on your specific needs.
So there's a question from George, which says, should we start developing in HTML5 right now? Are the browsers ready to take it? And we kind of covered this, George, I don't know if you saw it or not, in a flow chart in terms of if you should be thinking about HTML5. The reality is if your users are using modern browsers, and I think you know which ones those are, you're in really good shape. I mean, it's very well supported, and it's almost even better supported in the mobile browser world, and are being, you know, like I said, up until May, I was working with Disney, and I can tell you from the user base they're just heavily used, and so they're absolutely ready to take it. You still want to do feature detection, those sorts of things, but you always want to do that just to know what users are on.
Yeah. Somebody asked a question related to tools for debugging JavaScript, and one really nice thing that's happened in the past few years is that all the major browsers now include developer tools right in the browser. So you know, whether you're on Firefox or Chrome or Safari, you do have access to a JavaScript console. A lot of them include profiling tools. And then if you have a browser like Firefox, which has a lot of extensions, then you'll find all kinds of tools out there that extend the browser and help you debug your JavaScript code. So we're in a much better situation now than we used to be in terms of debugging JavaScript code.
So there we go. So there's a question about middleware for game creation in HTML5, and I'm sorry, I don't recognize the exact package construct 2 that someone mentioned, but in terms of what I think about it, I think this stuff's going to become more and more common. I mean, I think if you look at HTML and JavaScript, they're at some level really low-level languages in a way. And so I think there's going to be more and more toolkits for building higher-level things on top of these. I mean, you can even see like Adobe already doing this with Edge and that sort of thing, not so much in the game space, but they're already building tools where you can create, for instance, I think Edge is mostly aimed at sort of advertising animation. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing that, but from the examples I've seen. And you never touch HTML or JavaScript, but that's what, actually I think that generates a lot of CSS as well. So I think these are going to become more and more common, and it's kind of like today. There's a lot of people that use WordPress to create web pages. Yeah. And then there's people who know how to create web pages, and it's just where do you live in that ecosystem, and where, as a developer, can you get the maximum leverage? Right. So if you can use a toolkit and make a great game and attempt the time by using one, I think it's great. Yeah. And I know that there are several kind of JavaScript game platforms that are already being developed out there. I don't have their names on the tip of my tongue on it, but I know that there's one, for instance, that will help you simulate physics so that you can do, things bouncing off of each other more realistically and so on, and make that easier on yourself. So just do some Google searching. You will find some of those. There's a lot out there that are sort of in development right now. So they're probably still kind of in early stages. But I think, over the course of the next couple of years, some major players will kind of fall out of that mix and become that sort of game development platform for JavaScript. So there's a question about fallback if the user has disabled JavaScript. And I think the only way to really approach that's at the element level, right? It's kind of the typical old school, is there content in the script element that I can see if it's not enabled? But you really can't do anything fancy there. I mean, you don't have the ability to because you don't have any kind of scripting ability. Right. You can offer, there's media queries now for CSS so that you can offer different experiences, different styling experiences of the elements. So if you have, say you have a video element on your page and you have written an extensive, JavaScript API, but somebody's turned off that the JavaScript in their browser, then you can provide, say, an image fallback or a flash fallback and style the page a little differently using media queries, depending on what's available and what platform they're on. Here's a question that I don't think I can actually answer, but I'll put it out there because maybe people in the audience can answer, which is, what are the favorite tools for editing HTML5 for Windows? We're kind of avid Mac users, and so I don't know that we know the latest and greatest tools on the Windows platform, but right. hopefully the audience knows the answer to that question. Yeah, hopefully somebody in the chat window is pointing one out. There are new JavaScript IDEs now popping up. I'm a big fan of VI. Actually, I'll probably age myself by admitting that, but I tend to use VI for creating JavaScript. Well, so we shouldn't get in story mode here, but I saw James Gosling talking one time, and he was actually giving a huge overview of a new IDE out of Sun, and someone raised their hand and said, "What do you use?" And he said, VI. So there you go. Maybe that's a good place to end it before we get out of control here. Are there any other pressing questions, Yasmina, that we should try to answer, or do we want to wrap it up?
Sure. Let's see. I see one question just came in. Gabriel asks, will there ever be a JavaScript database with SQL in the HTML5 specification?
So that's an interesting question, and there was going to be, but I think now that has been kicked out for technical reasons, right? Because there's only one implementation, therefore it can't be a standard. Right. There are competitors coming along, though. Yeah. I would be loath to bet against having a database in HTML. I think that we'll probably have something. The thing is, it's well supported, though. So. Yeah, it is very well supported. So it matters how that's going to play out. Right. It's there. It may not be a standard, but if it's there, use it. Well, especially I don't know. Well, if you're targeting like iOS users, then you know that everybody's got it, so use it. If you're targeting desktop people and you don't necessarily know that everybody's got access to that, then that's a little different situation. So it's going to take a little while for that to fall out, I think. Yeah, that's one where definitely go do your research, because I think we know enough to be dangerous on that topic at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think.
Great. And one final question from Robert. Robert asks, can you recommend a good source for using JSON-P and creating services that return JSON?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter is a really good example.
Yes. Twitter's a great way to experiment with JSON because you can access some of the JSON feeds without having to do authentication. So it's a great way to experiment if you don't want to get into implementing OAuth. And other services, however, have it, like Facebook also has a JSON-P feed, but you do...
Pretty much any web service that is a known web service at this point has JSON-P.
Yeah, but a lot of them you do have to authenticate with.
I didn't catch that part of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it makes it harder for you to get going. To create JSON-P as a feed is fairly simple. You would need to, basically offer a web service that checked to see what kind of query you were getting from the user. And then the way that Twitter does it, for instance, they have, a part of their URLs is where you specify that you want JSON versus XML. And then there's another part of the URL where you can specify what your callback function is. And then that allows the user to tell you, well, I want my callback function to be called, update tweets or something. And so all you have to do then is generate your data in the JSON format and then wrap it with whatever that the user specified as the callback function name that they want.
Yeah.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. JSON-P is a cool little trick. Just wrap your head around what it does first before you try it, and just make sure you trust the remote source.
Yeah. All right. That's all the questions I see that have come in. Did you want to leave our audience with any other details before we wrap up?
No, other than join us at Wickedly Smart, and for a lot of things that we saw, obviously check out the book, and love to hear from anyone. And thanks for attending.
Yeah, thank you very much.